The bells echoed at the entrance of the market, blending with the distant melody of Silent Night playing through the speakers. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made even your breath feel heavier. Robert pushed the shopping cart slowly, the sound of the wheels serving as a reminder of his own loneliness. People rushed past him, but he walked without hurry, almost as if he didn't want that night to end. Or maybe because he already knew that, in the end, no one was waiting for him. At the bottom of the cart, there were only a few items: a bag of flour, butter, a carton of eggs. It wasn't much, but then again, who else did he need to buy for? His wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years ago. The kids were too busy with their own families, sending quick messages and photos over the phone, as if an emoji could fill the void of a hug. As he passed the aisle of cookies and sweets, his eyes fell on a jar of molasses. He stood still, his hand frozen in midair. It took him back in time, decades ago, to the small kitchen of his childhood. The light was dim, but the smell was unforgettable. Molasses boiling on the stove while he and his younger brother, David, stood beside their mother, eager to taste the Christmas cookies. David, just the name made his chest tighten. He could hear his brother's laughter echoing in his mind, so vivid yet so distant at the same time. They were inseparable until that fateful day. Just for a while, the social worker had said, holding David's hand. But that while turned into a lifetime. Robert blinked, pushing the memory away. There was no room for ghosts in the crowded market. He placed the jar of molasses in the cart and moved on. But something in his chest felt too tight. Why did he always go back to this time of year? Maybe it was the smell of Christmas trees or the lights twinkling in the windows. Maybe it was because, deep down, he still expected something. Something he didn't dare name. When he reached the checkout, the line was long, and he let out a sigh. In front of him, a young mother was trying to calm 2 children who were crying at the same time. The older boy pulled at her coat, while the younger one held onto a stuffed animal. Robert looked at the 2 boys and felt his heart tighten even more. For a moment, he saw himself and David, running together through the snow, laughing as if nothing could ever separate them. But everything can change in the blink of an eye, he thought, staring into the empty space. The cash register beeped, pulling him out of his reverie. He put the bags in the cart and headed out to the parking lot. The snow was falling harder now, covering the asphalt with a thin, shining layer. He stopped, pulled his coat tighter against the wind, and looked up at the sky. The streetlight reflections shimmered on the snowflakes, creating an almost magical glow, but he didn't feel the magic, only the cold. Why do I still think about him? He asked himself, tightening his grip on the bag handles. If I was going to find him, it would have happened by now. He let out a long sigh, almost as if he wanted to release years of accumulated regret. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear it. It was just a sound, a laugh, but something about it made time stop. He turned his head, his heart pounding. It couldn't be, or could it? The laugh cut through the cold air like a shard of glass, faint but distinct. Robert stopped dead in his tracks, his breath forming pale clouds in the frosty night. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. The bustling shoppers, the honking car horns, the sound of a child crying in the distance. All he could hear was that laugh, and in it, the echoes of a memory he hadn't dared revisit in decades. He tightened his grip on the shopping cart, his fingers trembling against the cold metal. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break free from his chest. That can't be him, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if trying to snap himself out of a dream. But dreams didn't feel this real. The laugh came again, this time a little louder. It wasn't the exact sound he remembered from so many years ago. Time had likely deepened it, smoothed its edges, but there was something unmistakable in its tone. It carried a warmth, a familiarity, as if it had traveled across decades just to reach him. Robert's eyes darted around the parking lot, searching for the source of the sound. The snow fell thicker now, dimming the glow of the streetlights and softening the sharp edges of the world. Families hurried past him, bundled up in scarves and hats, their arms full of last-minute Christmas shopping. He envied their hurried steps, their sense of purpose. They knew exactly where they were going, and who they were going home to. But Robert? Robert didn't even know what he was chasing. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow, then another. His legs felt heavier with each step, as if his body were resisting this pull. This sudden surge of hope that felt both ridiculous and undeniable. He scanned every face, every silhouette, his pulse quickening with every glance. Could it really be him? He thought. The question felt absurd. How could it be David? After all these years, after so much silence, why would tonight of all nights bring him back? And yet, Robert couldn't ignore the small, insistent voice whispering in the back of his mind. What if it is him? What if tonight is the night everything changes? Memories began to flood his mind, uninvited but vivid. He saw himself as a boy, running through the snow with David trailing close behind, their laughter blending together like music. He saw their small hands pressing cookie cutters into dough, flour dusting their faces as their mother scolded them playfully. He saw the day David was taken away, the way his little brother's tiny hand slipped out of his, the look of confusion on David's face as he was led out the door. Robert swallowed hard, trying to push the memories back where they belonged. This wasn't the time for nostalgia. Nostalgia didn't change anything. It didn't bring people back. But still, the laugh persisted. David, he whispered, barely audible, as if saying the name too loudly might scare away the possibility. The sound of it felt strange on his tongue, like speaking a word in a language you'd almost forgotten. He stopped walking and stood still, his breath catching in his throat, his head swiveled from side to side, his eyes desperately searching the thinning crowd. The laugh had come from somewhere close, he was certain of it. Don't be ridiculous, he told himself, shaking his head. It's just some stranger who happens to sound like him. That's all. But his body didn't believe his words. His hands were clammy despite the cold, and his legs felt weak beneath him. The market was starting to empty out now, the last-minute shoppers heading home to wrap presents and prepare for Christmas morning. The streetlights flickered against the falling snow, casting long, uneven shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. A Salvation Army volunteer, braving the cold for donations. Robert took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wanted to leave, to push the cart to his car and drive home to his quiet, empty house. But something inside him wouldn't let him go. He hadn't felt this way in years, this strange mix of fear and longing, as if the universe were pulling him towards something he couldn't yet see. Why tonight? He thought. Why here, in this market, in the middle of nowhere? If it was really him, why now? And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had a hand in this. Maybe it was the magic of Christmas, the time of year when impossible things seemed just a little more possible. Or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, giving him a glimmer of hope he didn't deserve. His chest tightened as he thought about what he would even say if it were David. How do you speak to someone who was taken from you a lifetime ago? What words could possibly bridge the gap of so many years, so much pain? Have you ever wondered, he thought, what you'd do if you got a second chance? Would you know what to say? Or would you stand there frozen, too afraid to believe it's real? The laugh came one last time, faint but clear, pulling him forward like a beacon. Robert's hands gripped the cart tighter as he took another step, then another. His heart raced, his breath quickened, and for the first time in years, he let himself hope. The doors of the market slid closed behind Robert with a faint mechanical hum, leaving him standing under the awning as the cold night pressed in around him. Snow swirled in the air, catching the golden light of the street lamps and turning it into a soft, glittering haze. He gripped the handle of his cart tightly, his knuckles pale against the metal, as the laugh rang out again. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the night with clarity, rising above the noise of car engines starting, shopping carts rolling, and the muffled chatter of families heading home. Robert's breath hitched. That sound, it wasn't just a laugh. It was his laugh. The laugh that used to echo in their small kitchen as their mother scolded them for sneaking cookie dough. The laugh that once burst out uncontrollably when they made snow angels until their clothes were soaked through. The laugh he hadn't heard in over 60 years but could recognize instantly. Robert stood frozen, the weight of decades pressing down on him. He tried to steady his breath, but it came in shallow, uneven bursts, clouding the air in front of him. Was it possible? Could it really be him? The snow fell harder now, dusting his shoulders and the brim of his old wool hat. He blinked, forcing himself to focus, scanning the rows of cars parked under the dim glow of the overhead lights. Families bustled around him, arms filled with brightly wrapped gifts and bulging shopping bags. Children skipped through the slush, laughing and calling out as their parents hurried to load the cars. But Robert wasn't paying attention to any of them. His eyes were searching, darting from one figure to the next, his heart pounding harder with every passing second. Then he saw him. A man stood by a weathered blue pickup truck a few rows away, his back turned as he loaded bags into the truck bed. He was wearing a gray coat, the kind of sturdy, practical outerwear that spoke of long winters, and a red scarf that stood out against the snowy backdrop. His movements were deliberate, methodical, nothing remarkable, nothing that should have caught Robert's attention. And yet, Robert couldn't look away. It wasn't just the laugh that pulled him toward this man. It was something about the way he moved. There was a familiarity in the way his shoulders slouched slightly as he worked, the way he adjusted the scarf against the wind. It was like seeing an old photograph brought to life, blurred at the edges but unmistakably real. Robert's legs felt rooted to the ground, his body heavy with the weight of possibility. He wanted to call out, but the words caught in his throat, tangled with fear and disbelief. What if he was wrong? What if this man turned around and he was just a stranger? David, he whispered, barely audible over the wind. The name lingered in the air, tasting strange on his tongue. It had been so long since he'd spoken it aloud, so long since he'd allowed himself to hope. The man paused, his hand gripping the edge of the truck's tailgate. Slowly, he straightened and turned his head, just enough for the light to catch the curve of his jaw. Robert's heart stopped. It was him. David. The name burst out of him, louder this time, carried by an urgency he couldn't control. The man turned fully now, his face illuminated by the streetlight. His features were older, weathered by time, but they were unmistakably familiar. The sharp line of his cheekbones, the deep-set eyes that still held the same spark Robert remembered. It was as if the years melted away in that moment, revealing the boy he'd lost all those decades ago. David's eyes widened, his body stiffening as he stared at Robert. For a moment, the two of them stood frozen, the snow falling silently around them as the world seemed to stop. Robert felt his knees weaken, his grip on the cart tightening as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His throat felt dry, and his voice cracked when he finally managed to speak. "David, is it really you?" David blinked, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Then, slowly, his expression softened, and recognition flickered across his face. "Robert." His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Robert let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring his vision as he took a step forward. "It's you," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd never see you again." David took a hesitant step closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "I thought," he trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to process the impossible. "I thought you'd forgotten about me." "Forgotten?" Robert's voice broke. "David, I've spent my whole life thinking about you, wondering where you were, what happened to you." His hands trembled as he wiped at his eyes, his breath hitching in his chest. "I never stopped hoping I'd find you someday." David's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy Robert remembered. The boy who had clung to him the day they were separated, tears streaming down his face as he begged not to be taken away. The two men moved closer, closing the distance between them. David reached out, his gloved hand shaking as it touched Robert's arm. "It's really you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. Robert nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "It's me, David. I'm here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there in the falling snow, their breaths mingling in the cold air, as if afraid that saying too much would shatter the fragile reality of the moment. Finally, David broke the silence, a small, hesitant smile tugging at his lips. "I can't believe it. After all these years, Robert let out a shaky laugh, his own smile breaking through the tears. I thought I'd lost you forever. David's hand tightened on Robert's arm. You never lost me, he said softly. We were just waiting to find each other again. The snow fell heavier, muffling the sounds of the world around them. But in that moment, there was nothing else. Just the two of them, standing together at last, as if no time had passed at all. The world outside the blue pickup truck seemed to fade away. The rush of families in the parking lot, the crunch of snow under hurried boots, the blinking red and green lights strung along the market's facade. It all became background noise to the moment unfolding between the two brothers. Robert couldn't stop staring at David's face, searching for traces of the boy he had once known. David looked back at him with the same intensity, his breath visible in the icy air. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he smiled faintly, a bittersweet curve of his lips that carried the weight of decades. You still look like the older brother I remember, David finally said, his voice low but steady. Robert let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. The older brother, sure, but a lot grayer now, he said, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. David chuckled at that, and the sound made Robert's chest tighten. It was the same laugh, warmer, deeper with age, but still unmistakably David's. Gray suits you, David replied. Then, after a pause, his voice softened. You look like Dad. Robert blinked, surprised by the comment. Do I? David nodded, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. Joy, sadness, nostalgia. Yeah, it's in the way you stand, the way you hold yourself. I don't know, I see him when I look at you. Robert's throat tightened, and he found himself unable to speak for a moment. Memories of their father surfaced. His warm laugh, his steady hands lifting them up when they were small, his deep voice telling them bedtime stories about brave nights and endless adventures. And you, Robert said after a moment, his voice trembling slightly, you still have Mom's eyes. I don't think I ever told you that, but I see her every time I look at you. David's face softened, but the emotion in his expression was unmistakable. I used to hate hearing that, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck with a sheepish smile. When people said it back then, it just reminded me of everything I didn't have anymore, of how much I missed her. Robert felt a pang of guilt at those words. He thought of all the years David had been on his own, without family to remind him of who he was or where he came from. I missed her too, Robert said quietly. Every day. I missed all of us. David looked down at the snow, his boots shifting slightly as if trying to find balance on uneven ground. I always wondered, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, if you missed me too. The words hit Robert like a punch to the chest. He reached out, gripping David's arm firmly. Of course I missed you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Every single day, David. Not a Christmas went by that I didn't think about you. Not one. David's eyes flicked up to meet his, searching his face for the truth. Really? Really? Robert said, nodding fiercely. I used to wonder where you were, what you were doing, if you were okay. And every year, when Christmas came around, I'd make those ginger molasses cookies Mom used to bake. I don't know, it made me feel closer to you somehow. David's lips parted in surprise. You still make those? Robert smiled, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. Every single year. I found Mom's old recipe in her handwriting after she passed. It felt like she left it there just for me, like she wanted me to keep the tradition alive. So I did. For her. And for you. David's hand moved to his mouth, and he blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. I haven't had those cookies since before, he said, his voice breaking slightly. They were my favorite. You remember how I'd always sneak one before they cooled? Robert chuckled, nodding. You always got caught too. Every single time. She always pretended to be mad, David said with a small laugh, his voice filled with nostalgia. But you're right, she loved it. She loved making those cookies for us. There was a long pause as the two brothers stood in silence, the snow falling softly between them. The memories felt so vivid, so alive, that for a moment it was as if they had stepped back in time. "David," Robert said finally, his voice quiet but resolute, "I'm so sorry. For not finding you sooner. For not trying harder. I thought about it so many times, but I didn't know where to start. And as the years went on, I started to believe. Maybe it was too late." David looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he shook his head. "It wasn't your fault, Robert. We were just kids. There wasn't anything you could have done." He paused, his gaze softening. "But I never stopped wondering about you. Every Christmas, I'd think about you. I'd wonder if you remembered me." Robert's breath caught in his throat. "I never forgot you," he said firmly. "Not for a second. You were always with me, David. Even when I didn't know where you were here." He placed a hand over his chest, his voice breaking with emotion. David nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know how much I needed to hear that," he said quietly. Robert smiled through his own tears. "It's Christmas, David. And if Christmas is about anything, it's about second chances. About finding what you thought was lost." David let out a shaky breath, nodding again. "You're right. Maybe it's not too late after all." "It's not," Robert said firmly. "It's not too late for us, David. We've lost a lot of years, but tonight, we have tonight." David's lips quirked into a small, tentative smile. "What do you say we start with those cookies?" Robert laughed, his heart swelling with warmth for the first time in years. "I say it's about time." The two of them stood there a moment longer, the snow falling steadily around them, before David stepped closer and pulled Robert into a tight embrace. For the first time in decades, the space between them was gone, and Robert felt whole again. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the parking lot in a pristine white glow. The air was cold and sharp, but Robert barely noticed it. For the first time in years, his chest didn't feel weighed down by loneliness. The warmth of David's embrace lingered, thawing something inside him that he thought had been frozen forever. David pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on Robert's shoulders. His eyes were red, glistening with tears that he no longer bothered to hide. "So," he said, his voice shaky but light, "where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air, simple but profound. Robert let out a soft laugh, glancing at the snow-covered ground as he searched for an answer. "Honestly," he said, looking back at David, "I don't know. I spent so many years imagining this moment, but now that it's here," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I just want to make up for lost time." David smiled faintly, his lips curling upward in a way that was both familiar and heartbreaking. "We've got a lot to make up for," he said. "A lifetime, really." Robert nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "We'll start with tonight," he said, his voice growing steadier. "You're coming with me. We'll go to my house, and I'll make those ginger molasses cookies, just like Mom used to." David's eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment, he looked almost boyish, as if the suggestion had pulled him straight back to their childhood. "You mean it?" "Of course I mean it," Robert said with a small laugh. "Unless you've got somewhere else to be tonight?" David hesitated, glancing toward the open tailgate of his truck. "No," he admitted, his voice soft. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." A flicker of something passed across Robert's face, joy mixed with a pang of sadness. He gestured toward David's truck. "Then let's get going. You can follow me to the house." David hesitated again, his expression faltering. Actually, he scratched the back of his neck, looking almost sheepish. "My truck's not exactly reliable these days. It barely made it here as it is." Robert blinked, then smiled, shaking his head. "Well, some things never change," he said with a chuckle. "You were always breaking something when we were kids. Bikes, toys, anything with wheels." David laughed, the sound rich and full, and Robert couldn't help but join in. It felt good, natural, as though the years between them hadn't existed at all. "Well," Robert continued, nodding toward his car, "you're riding with me, then? We'll come back for your truck later." David opened his mouth to argue, but then closed it again, his smile widening. "Okay, big brother," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "Lead the way." The The two of them walked toward Robert's car, the snow crunching under their boots. As they moved, Robert glanced sideways at David. He looked older, of course, but there was still a certain lightness about him, a spark that had survived all the years and hardships. "You know," Robert said as they reached his car, "I used to picture this moment, you and me, finding each other again. I'd imagine all these big, dramatic things I'd say. Things I thought would make up for everything." David paused, looking at him with curiosity. "And now?" Robert opened the car door and turned to face him, his breath clouding the air between them. "Now I realize," he said softly, "the words don't matter as much as this. You being here. Us being together again." David's face softened, and for a moment, he looked younger. Like the little brother Robert used to protect, the boy who used to run to him whenever he fell and scraped his knee. "I never thought I'd get this," David said quietly, his voice trembling. "Not after all this time." Robert reached out, gripping David's shoulder firmly. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But we have it now, and we're not going to waste it." David nodded, his expression resolute. "No, we're not." They climbed into the car, and as Robert started the engine, the soft hum of the heater filled the cabin. The radio came on automatically, playing a familiar Christmas tune. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable now, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. As Robert pulled out of the parking lot, David glanced out the window, watching the snow-covered town pass by. "You know," he said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I don't even remember what those cookies taste like. It's been so long." Robert smiled as he kept his eyes on the road. "You'll remember," he said confidently. "The first bite will bring it all back. You'll see." David turned to look at him, his expression softening. "You've been holding on to all of this for so long, haven't you? The cookies, the memories, everything." Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel for a moment before he nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. "I guess I was afraid to let it go. Like if I stopped making them, stopped thinking about you, it would mean you were really gone." David didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was steady, filled with quiet reassurance. "I was never gone, Robert. Not really. I think a part of me always knew you were out there, somewhere." Robert glanced at him, his chest tightening with emotion. "We're together now," he said, his voice firm. "And that's all that matters." David nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Yeah," he said softly, "that's all that matters." The two of them drove through the quiet streets, the car filled with the warmth of their newfound connection. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in a layer of white, as though the world itself was pausing to mark the significance of this moment. The car rolled to a stop in front of a modest house tucked behind a row of snow-laden pines. Warm light spilled out of the front windows, casting a golden glow over the freshly fallen snow. A simple wreath hung on the door, adorned with a red bough that fluttered gently in the cold breeze. Robert shut off the engine and glanced at David. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them waited with the unspoken emotions of the night. "This is it," Robert said finally, his voice soft. "Home." David looked out the window, his eyes tracing the outline of the house, the familiar shape of the snow-covered driveway. "It's cozy," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It feels like Christmas should feel." Robert chuckled, his breath visible in the cold air as they stepped out of the car. "That's what Margaret always said," he replied, his smile tinged with a note of sadness. "She loved this time of year. Said it made the world feel smaller, warmer. Like anything was possible." David paused as he closed the car door, his brow furrowing slightly. "Margaret, she was your wife, wasn't she?" Robert nodded, his eyes softening. "Yeah. She passed about 5 years ago." David hesitated, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. "I'm sorry, Robert. I didn't know." "You couldn't have," Robert said gently. "But thank you. She would have loved to meet you, David. She always told me family was the most important thing in the world." He turned to the house, motioning for David to follow. "Come on, let's get out of this cold. I'll tell you all about her while we bake." David followed Robert up the walkway, his boots crunching in the snow. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a blanket. The scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of cinnamon from a candle burning on the kitchen counter. A small, artificial Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches adorned with twinkling lights and ornaments that looked like they had been lovingly collected over decades. "This is nice," David said, his voice low as he took in the space. His eyes lingered on the tree, on a photograph resting on the mantel above the fireplace. "Is that her?" Robert followed his gaze to the photo. It was a picture of Margaret, her face lit up with laughter as she leaned into Robert's side. He nodded. "Yeah, that's her. She always had a way of making everything feel brighter." David smiled faintly, his fingers brushing over an ornament shaped like a snowflake. "I can tell," he said. "She must have been something special." "She was," Robert agreed, "and she always believed in making Christmas magical, no matter what. I think she'd be glad you're here tonight." David looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Me too," he said softly. Robert clapped his hands together, breaking the moment with a touch of warmth. "All right," he said, "time to get to work. Let's see if you still remember how to make cookies." David laughed, following Robert into the kitchen. "Oh, I remember how to eat cookies," he teased. "Making them? That's a different story." The kitchen was small but cozy, its counters lined with jars of flour, sugar, and spices. Robert pulled a handwritten recipe card from a wooden box, placing it carefully on the counter. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear. "Mom's ginger molasses cookies." David stared at the card for a long moment, his fingers brushing lightly over the handwriting. "It's really hers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded. "I found it when I was cleaning out her things. It was tucked away in an old cookbook, like she was saving it for us." David swallowed hard, his hand lingering on the card before pulling back. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steadier now. "Let's make them." They set to work, falling into an easy rhythm despite the years that had separated them. Robert measured the dry ingredients, his movements precise and practiced, while David cracked eggs into a bowl with the same messy enthusiasm he had as a child. "You still crack them like a maniac," Robert teased, laughing as David wiped yolk from his fingers. "Some things never change," David shot back, grinning. The room filled with the sound of their laughter, the clatter of measuring cups, and the faint hum of Christmas music playing on the radio. For a moment, it was as though they were boys again, standing side by side in their mother's kitchen, the years and losses between them melting away like sugar in the oven's heat. When the first tray of cookies went into the oven, Robert leaned against the counter, a satisfied smile on his face. "Smell that?" he asked, gesturing toward the oven. David closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The warm, spicy aroma filled the kitchen, wrapping around them like a memory made real. "It smells like home," he said quietly. Robert's smile softened, and he nodded. "It does." As the cookies baked, they sat at the small kitchen table, the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting in their cups of coffee. David leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "This feeling, like I'm part of something." "You never stopped being part of it," Robert said firmly. "You were always my brother, David, no matter how far apart we were." David looked at him, his eyes glistening. "Thanks for not giving up on me." "I never could," Robert said, his voice soft but unwavering. "Family doesn't give up. Not ever." The timer on the oven beeped, breaking the moment. Robert stood, a grin spreading across his face. "All right, let's see if they're as good as you remember." David followed him to the oven, the two of them leaning over as Robert pulled out the tray. The cookies were golden brown, their edges slightly crisp, their center soft and fragrant. David reached for one, yelping as it burned his fingers. Robert laughed, shaking his head. "Still can't wait for them to cool, huh?" "Some things never change," David said with a grin, blowing on the cookie before taking a bite. His eyes widened as the flavors hit his tongue, and he looked at Robert, his face lighting up with pure, unfiltered joy. "It's exactly like I remember," he said around a mouthful. "Exactly." Robert smiled, his chest swelling with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Welcome home, David," he said quietly. David swallowed, his eyes meeting Robert's. "It's good to be home," he replied. The warm glow of the kitchen lights reflected in the glossy surface of the cookies as they cooled on the counter. David leaned against the table, a half-eaten cookie in his hand, and watched Robert move around the kitchen with practiced ease. The faint hum of Christmas music played in the background, blending with the occasional crackle of the fireplace in the other room. "These really are just like Mom used to make," David said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, thoughtful, as though he were savoring more than just the taste of the cookie. Robert smiled, setting down a steaming mug of coffee in front of David before sitting across from him. "I've had a lot of practice," he replied. "Every Christmas, it felt like it was my way of keeping her here with me. With us." David nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. He turned the cookie over in his hand, as if studying its imperfections. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "I spent so many years trying to forget everything. I thought it would hurt less if I didn't remember." He looked up, his eyes meeting Robert's. "But sitting here, eating these cookies, it's like all the good parts come rushing back. I didn't think I'd ever have that again." Robert's chest tightened at David's words. He reached out, resting a hand on his brother's arm. "You never had to forget, David. The good parts, they were always yours to keep." David stared at him for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I guess I just didn't think anyone else remembered," he said quietly. "I remembered," Robert said firmly. "Every laugh, every argument, every time we got in trouble for sneaking out to play in the snow. I remembered all of it." David laughed softly, shaking his head. "Those were the days, weren't they?" "They were," Robert agreed, a fond smile spreading across his face. "Even when we got grounded for tracking mud through the house after building snow forts." David grinned, the memory pulling him back. "Mom was so mad, but Dad just laughed. I remember him saying, 'Boys will be boys.'" "Yeah," Robert said, his eyes misty with nostalgia. "And then she made us hot chocolate anyway. Said it was Christmas, and we couldn't go to bed mad." The brothers fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of their shared memories filling the room with a quiet warmth. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. "It's nice here," he said after a moment. "Quiet. Feels safe." Robert tilted his head, studying David's expression. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Where have you been all these years?" David hesitated, his gaze lingering on the twinkling lights of the tree. "Everywhere, I guess," he said finally. "After I aged out of the system, I just drifted. I'd pick up jobs here and there, never stayed in one place too long. I think I was afraid to get attached, you know? Like if I stayed too long, it'd hurt more when I left." Robert's heart ached at the quiet pain in David's voice. "That sounds lonely," he said softly. "It was," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it was easier that way. No expectations, no disappointments." He looked down at his hands, his fingers curling around the mug of coffee. "I told myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own." Robert leaned forward, his voice steady and calm. "But you're not on your own anymore, David. You have me. You've always had me." David looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't even know how to start, Robert. How do you rebuild something after so many years?" "One step at a time," Robert said simply. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight, but we have tonight, and we'll take the rest as it comes." David nodded slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. It feels so unreal, being here with you. Like I'm dreaming or something." "Well," Robert said with a small smile, "if you are, it's the best dream I've ever had too." David laughed softly, shaking his head. "You always knew what to say, didn't you?" "I try," Robert replied with a wink. They sat in silence for a while longer, the room filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights and the gentle hum of the radio. Finally, David leaned forward, his expression more relaxed now. You said Margaret believed in making Christmas magical, he said. What would she do if she were here? Robert smiled, his gaze drifting to the photograph on the mantel. She'd make sure we didn't waste a second, he said. She'd pull out the old board games, put on one of those cheesy Christmas movies she loved, and insist we stay up all night talking. David's smile widened. She sounds like she was amazing. She was, Robert said, his voice soft. And you're right. She wouldn't want us to waste tonight. He stood, moving to a cabinet and pulling out a stack of old board games. What do you say we keep her tradition alive? David's eyes lit up as he recognized the worn boxes. Is that Scrabble? And Monopoly? The very same, Robert said with a grin. Think you still remember how to play? David laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Oh, I remember. But just so you know, I'm still terrible at spelling. Robert chuckled, setting the games on the table. Well, I guess some things never change. The two of them sat down, the cookies cooling nearby, the tree casting a warm glow over the room. And for the first time in decades, Robert and David were together, laughing and talking as though no time had passed at all. The board game sat open on the table, its pieces scattered across the well-worn surface. Robert leaned back in his chair, laughing so hard that tears streamed down his face. Across from him, David held up a tiny plastic house, his own laughter filling the room. I swear, you're making these rules up as you go, David exclaimed, shaking his head as he tried to catch his breath. Robert raised his hands in mock defense. Hey, it's not my fault you don't remember how Monopoly works. Maybe if you stayed out of jail for more than 2 turns, you'd understand the strategy. David groaned dramatically, slumping back in his chair. I forgot how competitive you are. This is supposed to be fun, you know? Oh, it's fun for me, Robert teased, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. David leaned forward, pointing an accusing finger at him. You've been hoarding all the good properties. Don't think I didn't notice. That's called smart investing, Robert shot back, winking. For a moment, it was as if the years melted away. The laughter, the playful banter. It all felt so familiar, so natural. It reminded them both of simpler times, when their biggest worries were who got to be the race car token and whether Mom would let them stay up late to finish the game. David reached for another cookie, biting into it as he surveyed the board with exaggerated seriousness. All right, big brother, he said through a mouthful. Your reign of terror ends here. I'm taking you down. Robert smirked, crossing his arms. I'd like to see you try. They played on, the game becoming less about winning and more about the joy of being together. The hours slipped by, the clock on the wall ticking softly as the snow outside continued to fall. At one point, David leaned back, stretching his arms above his head. Man, I haven't laughed like this in, I don't even know how long, he admitted. His voice tinged with something deeper. Robert's expression softened. It's been too long, he said simply. David nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. You know, he began, his tone quieter now. For a long time, I thought I didn't deserve this. Didn't deserve to have a family again. Robert frowned, leaning forward. Why would you think that? David shrugged, his fingers idly spinning one of the game pieces. I don't know. I guess, after everything, I just felt like I didn't belong anywhere. Like I'd been gone too long, and everyone had moved on without me. Robert reached across the table, his hand resting firmly on David's. You belong here, he said, his voice steady and resolute. With me, with this family. That's never changed, David. Not for me. David looked up, his eyes glistening. I didn't think you'd still want me after all this time, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course I do, Robert said, his tone firm but gentle. You're my brother, David. Time doesn't change that. Nothing does. David swallowed hard, nodding as he looked down at their hands. I think I needed to hear that more than I realized, he said softly. Robert smiled, squeezing his brother's hand before letting go. Well, consider it the truth, he said. And don't you forget it. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the glow of the Christmas tree casting soft patterns of light across the room. Then David's eyes landed on an old photo album sitting on a nearby shelf. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked, nodding toward the album. Robert followed his gaze, his smile widening. "It is," he said. "Mom's old photo album. I found it when I was cleaning out the attic." David's eyes lit up with a mix of curiosity and excitement. "Can we look at it?" "Absolutely," Robert said, rising from his chair and retrieving the album. He set it on the table, the leather cover worn and faded with time. As they flipped through the pages, the past came rushing back in vivid detail. There were photos of their childhood. Robert holding a tiny David in his arms, both of them grinning from ear to ear. Pictures of snowball fights, family picnics, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and candles blown out in unison. "Look at this one," Robert said, pointing to a photo of them sitting on Santa's lap at the mall. "You cried the entire time." "I did not," David protested, leaning closer. But the evidence was clear. His red, tear-streaked face told a different story. Robert laughed. "Mom had to bribe you with candy canes just to get you to sit still long enough for the picture." David shook his head, chuckling. "I can't believe you kept all of this." "Of course I did," Robert said, his voice soft. "They were all I had of you for so long." David's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for holding on to these. For not giving up on me." Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "I never could," he said, "and I never will." They continued flipping through the album, their laughter and stories filling the room. The warmth between them grew with each memory, each shared moment pulling them closer together. By the time they reached the last page, the clock on the wall showed well past midnight. David leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "This has been the best Christmas I've had in, well, maybe ever," he said. Robert smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's been the best for me too, little brother." David glanced at the tree, the lights twinkling softly in the darkness. "It's funny," he said. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm home." "You are home," Robert said firmly, "and you always will be." David nodded, his smile widening. "Merry Christmas, Robert." "Merry Christmas, David," Robert replied, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. The warmth of the kitchen and the soft glow of the Christmas lights created a cocoon of comfort as the night stretched into the early hours of Christmas morning. David sat quietly at the table, his hand resting on the cover of the photo album they had just finished flipping through. The weight of the memories it held lingered in the air, heavy but not unwelcome. Robert stood by the sink, rinsing their coffee mugs. The faint hum of water running into the basin filled the space, mingling with the sound of the wind brushing against the window panes. He glanced over his shoulder, watching David stare down at the album, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts?" Robert asked, his tone light but tinged with genuine curiosity. David looked up, his lips curving into a small, tired smile. "Just thinking about how strange it all feels," he said. "Being here, with you, after all these years. It's like I've been holding my breath for decades, and tonight I finally let it out." Robert dried his hands on a dish towel and walked back to the table, pulling out a chair. He sat down across from David, his elbows resting on the table as he studied his brother's face. "Strange in a good way?" he asked. David nodded slowly. "Yeah, a good way, but also overwhelming. There's so much I missed, Robert. So many things I'll never get back." Robert leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You're right. We can't get back the years we lost. But that doesn't mean we can't make the most of what we have now." David let out a deep breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't even know where to start. How about here?" Robert said, gesturing to the room around them. "Tonight, we've already started, David. We've shared memories, we've laughed. We've baked cookies, badly, I might add." David chuckled at that, shaking his head. "They weren't that bad." "Oh, they were terrible," Robert teased, his grin widening. The laughter between them eased some of the tension, and David's shoulders relaxed as he leaned back in his chair. "It's been a long time since I felt this normal," he admitted. Robert tilted his head. watching him closely. "You know what I think? I think normal is overrated. What matters is that you're here now, and we have the chance to make new memories. Starting tomorrow, no today. It's Christmas morning, after all." David glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing with a start that it was just past midnight. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, the words carrying a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Merry Christmas, David," Robert replied, his voice filled with quiet joy. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Then David's gaze drifted back to the photo album. He opened it again, his fingers brushing over a photo of them as children, their faces bright with laughter as they sat together in front of a Christmas tree. "I can't believe how much I forgot," David said quietly. "It's like all of this was locked away somewhere, and I didn't even realize it. Sometimes, we block out the good to protect ourselves from the bad," Robert said, his tone thoughtful. "But the good never really goes away, David. It's always there, waiting for us to find it again." David nodded, his fingers lingering on the photo. "You're a good man, Robert," he said suddenly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Better than I deserve." Robert frowned, shaking his head firmly. "Don't say that. You deserve this, David. You deserve family, love, and all the good things that come with it. Don't let anyone, least of all yourself, convince you otherwise." David looked up at him, his eyes glistening. "You always knew how to talk me out of my own head," he said with a small smile. Robert chuckled. "That's what big brothers are for." The quiet hum of the heater filled the room as the two brothers sat there, letting the weight of their conversation settle. Finally, Robert stood, stretching his arms above his head. "All right, enough of the heavy stuff for tonight. We've got a busy day ahead of us." David raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Busy? Doing what?" "Celebrating Christmas," Robert said with a grin. "I've got a box of decorations in the garage we can dig out, and I was thinking we could visit the church later for the candlelight service. Margaret and I used to go every year." David hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "I haven't been to a church in, well, a long time." "There's no pressure," Robert said quickly, "but it's a beautiful service, and it might be a nice way to end the day." David nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said. "Let's see how the morning goes." Robert smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit." As they began cleaning up the remnants of their evening, putting away the board game, stacking the empty cookie tray in the sink, David glanced around the room, taking in the simple decorations and the cozy warmth of the house. "You've made a good life here, Robert," he said. "A real home." Robert paused, his gaze softening as he looked at his brother. "It's not a home without family, David. But now that you're here, it finally feels complete." David swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thanks for letting me be a part of it," he said quietly. "You've always been a part of it," Robert replied. "I'm just glad you're here to see it now." They finished tidying up, the quiet companionship between them feeling as natural as it had in their youth. As they turned off the kitchen lights and headed toward their respective rooms, David paused in the hallway, glancing back at Robert. "Good night, big brother," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Robert smiled, his heart full. "Good night, David. Merry Christmas." The first light of Christmas morning crept through the edges of the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow across Robert's living room. The faint sound of a nearby church bell chimed, cutting through the stillness. Robert stirred in his chair by the fireplace, a blanket draped over his lap. The embers in the hearth glowed faintly, casting a warm flicker across the room. He blinked a few times, adjusting to the light, and stretched. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of peace on Christmas morning. For so long, the day had been a bittersweet reminder of what he'd lost. But now, the house didn't feel so quiet. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of a door creaking open. A moment later, David shuffled into the room, his hair tousled and his expression groggy. He wore an old sweater that Robert had lent him, a size too big, but it somehow made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Morning," David mumbled, rubbing his eyes as he plopped down on the couch. "Morning," Robert replied, a smile tugging at his lips. Merry Christmas. David glanced around the room, taking in the softly glowing Christmas tree and the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. Merry Christmas, he said, his voice quieter now, more reflective. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Did you sleep okay? David nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. Yeah, better than I have in a long time. Good, Robert said. He stood, heading toward the kitchen. How about some coffee? Or maybe something better? Margaret's Christmas cocoa. She had this secret recipe, and it's the best thing you'll ever taste. David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Secret recipe? Huh? All right, I'm in. Impress me. Robert laughed as he pulled out a saucepan and started gathering ingredients. Cocoa powder, sugar, milk, and a hint of something extra, a pinch of cinnamon and a splash of vanilla. As he worked, David wandered into the kitchen, leaning against the counter and watching him. Smells good already, David said. It's all in the cinnamon, Robert replied, giving him a wink. Margaret swore it made all the difference. Once the cocoa was ready, they carried their steaming mugs back to the living room and sat near the tree. David took a cautious sip, his eyes widening. Okay, you weren't kidding, he said, licking his lips. This is amazing. Told you, Robert said, grinning. She was always the genius in the kitchen. I just tried not to burn things. David chuckled, leaning back against the couch. I wish I could have met her. She sounds incredible. She was, Robert said softly, his voice tinged with both warmth and sadness. She would have loved you, David. She had this way of making everyone feel welcome, like they belonged. She would have made sure you felt right at home. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. I already do, he said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their cocoa and watching the soft glow of the tree. Then Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped package. What's that? David asked, his brow furrowing in curiosity. Robert handed it to him, his smile widening. Open it. David hesitated for a moment before peeling back the wrapping paper. Inside was a simple ornament, a small wooden star painted with the words "Family is forever." David stared at it for a long moment, his thumb brushing over the smooth surface. Robert, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is perfect. I saw it in a little shop downtown a few weeks ago, Robert said. I didn't know if I'd ever find you, but I knew. If I did, I wanted you to have it. David looked up at him, his eyes glistening. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything, for not giving up on me, for this. You don't have to thank me, Robert said, his voice steady. You're my brother, David. That's what family does. David nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through his emotion. Still, he said, this means more than I can say. Robert stood, taking the ornament from David's hand and walking to the tree. He turned back, raising an eyebrow. Want to help me find a good spot for it? David grinned, standing and joining him by the tree. Together, they found the perfect branch, hanging the star where the light caught it just right. As they stepped back to admire their work, David let out a contented sigh. You know, he said, I don't think I've ever had a Christmas that felt this real. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, his smile soft but full of meaning. This is just the beginning, David. From now on, every Christmas will feel like this. David turned to him, his eyes filled with gratitude. I'd like that, he said softly. Good, Robert said. Because you're stuck with me now, David laughed, shaking his head. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the morning sunlight grew brighter, spilling across the room, the brothers sat back down, the weight of the years between them growing lighter with every passing moment. The late morning sun peeked through the clouds, reflecting off the thick blanket of snow that coated the neighborhood. Robert and David stood bundled up by the front door, scarves wrapped snugly around their necks and boots crunching against the steps as they stepped outside. The cold air nipped at their faces, but it was refreshing, invigorating even, as they ventured out into the stillness of Christmas Day. It's been a long time since I walked in the snow, David said, his voice muffled by the wool scarf wrapped around his mouth. Robert glanced at him with a raised eyebrow. You live in the Midwest, don't you? Don't tell me you've been avoiding winter all this time. David chuckled, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. Avoiding it? No. But enjoying it? That's another story. Well, you're about to remember why we loved this as kids, Robert said with a grin, gesturing to the open expanse of the snowy street. The brothers began walking side by side, their pace slow and easy. The town was quiet, the streets nearly empty except for a few children playing with sleds in the distance. The sound of laughter echoed faintly through the crisp air, mingling with the soft crunch of their boots against the snow. David glanced around, taking in the rows of houses with their twinkling Christmas decorations. This neighborhood, it feels like something out of a postcard, he said. Robert smiled. That's what Margaret used to say. She loved the way everyone went all out for Christmas. Said it made her feel like part of something bigger. David nodded, his gaze lingering on a house with icicle lights strung along the roof. She must have been something special, he said softly. She was, Robert replied, his tone warm but wistful. She had this way of seeing the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. I think that's what I miss most about her. The way she made life feel brighter, easier. David looked over at his brother, his expression thoughtful. I can see why you loved her. Robert nodded, his eyes distant for a moment. Then he shook his head slightly, as if clearing the memories. But enough about me, he said. What about you? You've been on your own for so long. What's kept you going? David hesitated, his steps slowing. He stared down at the snow, his breath visible in the cold air. I don't know, he admitted. There were times I thought about giving up. Times when it felt like there wasn't a point to any of it. Robert's chest tightened at his brother's words. He stopped walking, turning to face David. But you didn't give up, he said quietly. Why not? David let out a long breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. I guess I always had this hope, he said, his voice low, that maybe there was something waiting for me. Someone. I didn't know what it was, but it kept me going. And now, standing here with you, I think, maybe it was this. Robert's throat tightened, but he forced a smile, clapping David on the shoulder. Well, I'm glad you held on, he said, his voice steady. Because I've been waiting for this, too. David glanced at him, his expression softening. It's strange, isn't it? How you can go so long thinking you're alone, and then, in one night, everything changes. Robert nodded, his smile widening. It's the magic of Christmas, he said. It has a way of bringing people back together, of reminding us what really matters. They walked on in silence for a while, the stillness between them comfortable, almost sacred. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the distant sound of a church bell rang out, marking the hour. As they approached the edge of the park, Robert stopped, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. You remember this place? He asked, gesturing to the snow-covered field ahead. David frowned, scanning the open space. Is this? The old park, Robert said, his eyes twinkling. We used to come here every winter when we were kids. Spent hours building forts and having snowball fights. David chuckled, shaking his head. I can't believe this place is still here. It is, Robert said. And I think it's time we relived some of those memories. Before David could respond, Robert bent down, scooping up a handful of snow and packing it into a ball. He straightened, his grin widening as he lobbed the snowball straight at David's chest. David let out a startled laugh as the snow exploded against his coat. Oh, you're asking for it now, he shouted, bending down to grab his own handful of snow. The brothers broke into laughter as they pelted each other with snowballs, their shouts echoing across the empty park. For a moment, they weren't grown men with decades of separation between them. They were kids again, laughing and running through the snow, their hearts light and unburdened. By the time they collapsed onto a bench, their faces red and their breath coming in short bursts, they were grinning from ear to ear. David brushed the snow off his coat, shaking his head. You haven't changed a bit, he said, still laughing. Neither have you, Robert replied, his voice filled with affection. They sat in silence for a moment, the cold air biting at their faces but doing little to dampen their spirits. David looked out at the snow-covered field, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for this," he said quietly. "For everything." "You don't have to thank me," Robert said, his tone warm. "This is what brothers do." David smiled, his eyes shining. "Still, it means a lot. More than I can say." Robert reached out, clasping David's shoulder firmly. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I already know." As the snow continued to fall, the two of them sat together, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the promise of a brighter future. The sun hung low in the sky as Robert and David walked back toward the house, their cheeks red from the cold and their laughter still lingering in the crisp air. As they approached the driveway, Robert paused, glancing toward his car parked nearby. "What do you say we make good on my promise?" Robert asked, tilting his head toward the vehicle. David furrowed his brow. "What promise?" "The candlelight service," Robert replied. "I know you said it's been a while, but there's something about it, David. The music, the warmth of the candles. It's always been my favorite part of Christmas." David hesitated, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. "I don't know," he said slowly. "It's been years since I stepped foot in a church. I'm not sure I'd feel right being there." Robert smiled gently, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "There's no right or wrong way to feel, little brother," he said. "The doors are open to everyone, and you don't have to do anything except sit and take it all in. If it's too much, we can leave any time." David studied Robert's face for a moment, then glanced toward the car. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." The drive to the small chapel didn't take long. The streets were quiet, lined with houses glowing with Christmas lights, their windows revealing silhouettes of families gathered around trees or dining tables. The sight filled David with a quiet ache, not painful but wistful, as though he were seeing a world he'd forgotten existed. When they pulled into the church parking lot, the building stood like a beacon against the snowy backdrop. Its tall steeple was lit by soft, golden lights, and a wreath adorned the wooden doors. People were filing inside, bundled in scarves and coats, their voices low but cheerful as they greeted one another. Robert led the way, holding the door open for David. Inside, the chapel was warm and inviting. The scent of evergreen filled the air, and rows of pews were decorated with garlands and red ribbons. Candles flickered along the aisle, casting a soft glow that danced across the walls. David hesitated at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room. It wasn't an imposing space, just a small, cozy sanctuary, but something about it made his chest tighten. "You okay?" Robert asked, his voice low. David nodded, though his movements were stiff. "Yeah," he said. "It's just been a long time." Robert gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "Come on, let's sit in the back, where we can slip out if you need to." They found a pew near the rear of the chapel and settled in. David glanced around, taking in the murmurs of the congregation and the soft hum of the organ as it began to play. The music was soothing, almost hypnotic, and he felt himself relax slightly, though his hands remained clasped tightly in his lap. As the service began, the pastor stepped forward, his voice warm and welcoming. He spoke about the meaning of Christmas, about hope and redemption, and about the way the season brought people together in unexpected ways. David listened, the words washing over him like a tide. Then the lights dimmed, and the pastor lit the first candle. One by one, the flame was passed through the congregation, each person lighting their own candle from their neighbors. When the soft glow reached their pew, Robert held his candle steady, tilting it to light David's. David watched the flame flicker to life, its warmth illuminating his hands. He stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening. Robert leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "This part always gets me," he said. "There's something about it. It feels like a fresh start, like a reminder that even the smallest light can make a difference." David swallowed hard, nodding but not trusting himself to speak. The congregation began to sing Silent Night, their voices blending in a gentle, haunting harmony. The melody filled the chapel, wrapping around David like a blanket. He closed his eyes, letting the music seep into him, and for the first time in years, he felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. When the service ended, The congregation began to file out, their voices low and reverent. David and Robert lingered for a moment, sitting in the soft glow of the remaining candles. "Thanks for bringing me here," David said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'm glad you came," Robert replied, his smile soft. "It's good to take a moment like this, to remember what matters." David nodded, staring down at the unlit candle in his hand. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I didn't think I'd feel anything, but I don't know. It's like something opened up." "That's the magic of it," Robert said. "Sometimes you don't realize how much you've been holding in until you let yourself be still." David looked at his brother, his expression thoughtful. "You've always been good at finding the right words," he said. Robert chuckled. "Comes with age," he teased. As they stepped back into the cold night, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow. They walked to the car in silence, the quiet between them no longer heavy, but comfortable. David paused before getting into the car, his gaze drifting up to the starry sky. "You were right, he said after a moment. "About what?" Robert asked. "Christmas," David said. "It does feel like a fresh start." Robert smiled, clapping him on the back. "It is, David. For both of us." They climbed into the car and drove home, the warmth of the service still lingering with them. The road ahead seemed brighter now, and for the first time in years, David felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The drive back to Robert's house stretched out like a quiet, peaceful interlude. Snowflakes floated in the air, illuminated by the car's headlights, their delicate forms dissolving as they touched the windshield. Inside the car, warmth from the heater filled the silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. For Robert and David, it was the kind of stillness that only came when words weren't necessary. David leaned his head against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the world pass by. The houses they drove past were alight with the glow of Christmas decorations, each one offering a glimpse into other people's celebrations. A father carrying a child inside, a woman lighting candles in a window, the faint sound of laughter that carried through the night. "Funny, isn't it?" David said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, contemplative. "What's funny?" Robert asked, glancing at him briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "How something as simple as lights in a window can make you feel hopeful," David replied. "I used to see things like that and feel disconnected, I guess. Like I was watching someone else's life, something I'd never have. But tonight, it's different. It feels like maybe, just maybe, I'm part of it again." Robert's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, his chest tightening at the quiet honesty in his brother's voice. "You've always been part of it, David," he said after a moment. "Even when you felt disconnected, you were never alone. I was here, waiting." David turned to look at him, his lips curving into a small, thoughtful smile. "I think I needed to hear that," he said. "I'm glad," Robert replied, his voice warm but steady. As they turned onto Robert Street, the familiar sight of his house came into view. The Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered yard. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a testament to the fire still burning in the living room. David exhaled slowly, taking in the scene. "It feels like home," he said quietly. "It is home," Robert said firmly. "And it's yours now, too." Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them immediately, the faint scent of pine and cinnamon lingering in the air. Robert hung their coats by the door and motioned for David to make himself comfortable. "Stay there," Robert said, his tone playful. "I'll grab us some snacks." "You can't end Christmas Day without something sweet," David chuckled, sinking into the armchair by the fireplace. He leaned back, his body relaxing into the soft cushions as he let his eyes roam over the room. The glow of the Christmas tree reflected off the ornaments, and the flicker of the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time in years, he felt a deep, quiet peace settle over him. When Robert returned, he carried a plate piled with cookies and 2 steaming mugs of hot cocoa. He set them down on the coffee table with a flourish, grinning. "Margaret's recipe, of course," he said. "Best cocoa you'll ever have." David reached for a mug, the heat warming his hands instantly. He took a cautious sip, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Okay, you weren't kidding," he said, licking a bit of foam from his lip. "This is incredible," Robert laughed, taking a sip of his own. "Margaret always said the secret was the cinnamon. I didn't believe her until I tried it myself." "She must have been amazing," David said, his voice softer now. "She was," Robert said, his expression growing wistful. "She had this way of making everything feel special, especially Christmas. She always said it was her favorite time of year because it brought out the best in people." David stared into his mug, his fingers curling around it. "I think I understand that now," he said. "Christmas, it's not about the decorations or the presents. It's about this." He gestured around the room, his voice thick with emotion. "The people, the moments." Robert nodded, his smile gentle. "Exactly. And you're part of this now, David. You always have been." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the space. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the world beyond the windows hushed and serene. After a while, Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped package. "I almost forgot," he said, handing it to David. David frowned slightly, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "What's this?" "Just open it," Robert said, his smile widening. David carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden ornament shaped like a star. Painted across its surface in elegant script were the words "Family is forever." David stared at it, his thumb brushing over the smooth wood. "Robert," he said, his voice cracking. "This is," he trailed off, unable to find the words. "I saw it in a shop downtown a few weeks ago," Robert said quietly. "I didn't know if I'd ever find you, but I knew. If I did, I wanted you to have it." David looked up at him, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said softly, "for this, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Robert replied, his voice steady. "You're my brother, David. This is where you belong." David nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through his emotion. "It feels good to be here," he said. Robert grinned, standing and motioning toward the tree. "Come on, let's find a spot for it." Together, they hung the ornament near the top of the tree, where the light caught it just right. They stepped back, admiring their work, the glow of the star reflecting in their eyes. "You know," David said after a moment, his voice thoughtful, "I didn't think I'd ever have a Christmas like this again." "Well," Robert said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "get used to it, because this is just the beginning." David turned to him, his smile widening. "I think I'd like that." As the fire burned low and the room grew quieter, the brothers settled back into their chairs, the weight of the years between them finally beginning to lift. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the final hours of Christmas Day. "To second chances," Robert said, raising his mug in an imaginary toast. David raised his own mug, his smile warm and full of hope. "To family," he said. They clinked their mugs together, the sound ringing softly in the stillness of the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. A clean slate, a fresh start. The morning after Christmas dawned quietly, with the world outside wrapped in a soft layer of untouched snow. Robert woke early, as he always did, the habit of years of routine too ingrained to break. He padded quietly into the kitchen, careful not to disturb David, and began brewing a pot of coffee. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, mingling with the faint remnants of pine and cinnamon from the night before. Robert stood by the kitchen window, gazing out at the snowy yard as the early morning light spilled across the horizon. It was peaceful, serene, a reminder that the world had turned the page to a new day. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to see David standing in the doorway, his hair tousled and his expression still hazy with sleep. "Morning," David said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Morning," Robert replied, pouring a second cup of coffee and sliding it across the counter. "How'd you sleep?" David took the cup, cradling it in his hands. "Better than I have in years," he said honestly. "Something about this place. It just feels right." Robert smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. Coffee's hot. Breakfast will be easy." We've got leftover cookies if you're feeling adventurous. David laughed softly, shaking his head. I think I've had enough cookies to last me until next Christmas. Robert chuckled. Fair enough. How about pancakes, then? Margaret's recipe, of course. She had a knack for making everything taste better. David nodded, his smile softening. That sounds great. As Robert moved around the kitchen, gathering ingredients and humming softly to himself, David leaned against the counter, watching him. There was something calming about the rhythm of it. The whisking, the sizzle of batter hitting the pan, the faint aroma of vanilla filling the air. This feels so normal, David said after a moment, his voice quiet. Robert glanced at him, his brow furrowing slightly. Is that a bad thing? David shook his head quickly. No, it's a good thing. A great thing, actually. I didn't realize how much I missed this. The normal stuff. Waking up, having coffee, talking in the kitchen. It's like I forgot what it felt like to belong somewhere. Robert paused, his hands stilling as he poured batter into the pan. He looked at David, his expression thoughtful. You've always belonged, David, he said gently, even when we were apart. That didn't change. And now that you're here, you don't have to feel like you're on the outside anymore. David nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. Thanks for saying that, he said. Just speaking the truth, Robert replied, flashing him a reassuring smile. Once breakfast was ready, they sat at the small kitchen table, the plates of pancakes steaming in front of them. Robert handed David a bottle of syrup and motioned for him to dig in. Margaret always insisted on adding a little extra vanilla to the batter, Robert said as he cut into his stack. Said it made all the difference. David took a bite, his eyes widening slightly. She wasn't wrong, he said around a mouthful. These are amazing. Robert laughed. Told you. She had a gift for these things. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the clink of forks against plates the only sound in the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the neighborhood in pristine white. After breakfast, Robert leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. So, what's next for you? He asked, his tone casual but curious. David hesitated, staring down at his empty plate. I don't know, he admitted. I didn't really think about what would come after this. I've been living day to day for so long that the idea of planning ahead feels strange. Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to have all the answers right now, he said, but you don't have to figure it out alone, either. Whatever you decide, you've got me here. David looked up, his eyes softening. Thanks, Robert. That means a lot. You don't have to thank me, Robert said firmly. Family sticks together. And besides, I've got plenty of room here if you want to stay a while. David blinked, surprised. You mean that? Of course, Robert said. It's not much, but it's home. And if it helps you find your footing, then it's yours for as long as you need. David smiled, a mixture of gratitude and relief washing over his face. I think I'd like that, he said quietly. Good, Robert said with a nod. Then it's settled. We'll take it one day at a time together. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet moments. They cleaned the kitchen together, laughing as Robert insisted on using Margaret's method for stacking dishes, which David found unnecessarily meticulous. They ventured outside to clear the driveway, trading jabs about who could shovel faster until they were both red-faced and breathless from the cold. As the afternoon stretched on, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Laughter echoed through the halls, and the warmth of their shared moments filled the space, pushing back the shadows of loneliness that had lingered there for so long. By the time evening fell, the brothers sat side by side on the couch, the glow of the Christmas tree casting a warm light across the room. David leaned back, his eyes half closed as he let out a contented sigh. This has been the best couple of days I've had in. I don't even know how long, he said. Robert smiled, his own heart full. It's been pretty great for me too, little brother. David glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. I'm glad I found my way back here, he said softly. Robert reached over, gripping his shoulder firmly. Me too, he said. You belong here, David. Don't ever doubt that. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet again, the bond between the brothers felt stronger than ever. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt full of promise. The late morning sun shone brightly in the clear winter sky, making the fresh snow sparkle like tiny diamonds scattered across the ground. The neighborhood was quiet, its stillness broken only by the soft crunch of boots as Robert and David walked side by side down the snowy sidewalk. The cold air bit at their faces, but neither seemed to mind. Robert pulled his scarf up higher around his neck, glancing over at David. "It's good to get out, isn't it?" he asked. David nodded, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Yeah, it is. I didn't realize how much I missed this. Just walking, taking in the quiet." He paused, looking around at the familiar houses. "It's like I've stepped back in time. Nothing's changed." "Not much anyway," Robert said with a small smile. "That's the thing about this neighborhood. It's steady. Always has been. Kind of comforting, isn't it?" David nodded again, his eyes scanning the street. Each house seemed to hold a faint echo of the past, a fragment of a memory just waiting to resurface. Strings of twinkling Christmas lights adorned the rooftops, their colors bright against the white snow. Wreaths hung on front doors, their ribbons fluttering gently in the light breeze. "Do the same people still live here?" David asked. "Some do," Robert said. "Like the Robinsons. Remember them?" He nodded toward a cozy house with a bright red door. "They used to give out the biggest candy bars on Halloween. You always wanted to hit their house first." David's brow furrowed as he tried to summon the memory. Slowly, a smile crept across his face. Yeah, I remember. Didn't they have a dog? A big golden retriever?" Robert grinned. "Max. He barked at us every time we walked by their fence." "You were terrified of him." David laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "I was convinced he was going to break through and come after us, but he never did," Robert said, his smile widening. "Max was the gentlest dog in the world. He wouldn't have hurt a fly. Didn't stop me from hiding behind you every time we passed their yard," David said, shaking his head at the memory. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic," Robert teased, his tone light. David smirked. "I preferred to think of it as self-preservation." They continued down the street, passing the small park where children were now playing. The sound of laughter and the sharp cries of excitement carried through the air, reminding them both of winters long past. David slowed as they neared the swing set, his gaze lingering on the snow-covered seats that swayed gently in the wind. "We used to come here all the time," he said, his voice quieter now. Robert stopped beside him, his hands resting in his coat pockets. "You loved those swings," he said. "You'd pump your legs as hard as you could, always trying to go higher than me." David smiled faintly. "Did I ever win?" Robert chuckled. "Once or twice. But I let you win. Kept you from sulking the whole way home." David turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "Sure you did." "Hey," Robert said with mock indignation. "A good big brother knows when to let his little brother think he's winning." David laughed, the sound warming the crisp air around them. "I'll take your word for it." They resumed walking, the sound of their boots crunching through the snow filling the comfortable silence between them. Robert led David to the edge of the neighborhood, where a small wooden bridge spanned a frozen creek. The bridge's planks creaked slightly under their weight as they stepped onto it, the sound echoing in the quiet. David stopped in the middle of the bridge, leaning against the railing as he looked down at the frozen water below. The creek was still and glassy, its surface reflecting the pale blue of the sky. "We spent so much time down there," David said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Building dams, catching frogs, pretending we were explorers." Robert joined him at the railing, his breath fogging in the cold air. "And getting covered in mud," he added with a grin. "Mom always made us change in the garage before she'd let us inside." David chuckled. "She was smart. She knew better than to let us track it all over the house." They stood there for a while, the memories washing over them like a gentle tide. The creek, the bridge, the snow-covered trees. It all felt familiar, like stepping back into a time when life was simpler, when their biggest worries were about whether they'd caught enough frogs to impress their friends. It's funny, David said after a moment, his voice quieter now. I spent so many years trying to forget this place. I thought, if I could block it out, it wouldn't hurt so much. Robert turned to look at him, his expression soft. I get that, he said, but blocking it out doesn't make it go away. It just buries it. And sometimes, it takes a little digging to find the good stuff again. David nodded, his hands gripping the railing. I think I needed this, he said, his voice trembling slightly. To remember, to feel like it's okay to hold on to the good parts. It is okay, Robert said firmly. You don't have to let go of the good to move forward. And you don't have to do it alone. David looked at him, his eyes glistening. Thanks, Robert, he said, for not giving up on me, for keeping all of this alive. Robert placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. That's what family does, he said. We hold on, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. David smiled, a mixture of gratitude and relief spreading across his face. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As they began the walk back home, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The air was crisp and clear, and for the first time, David felt like he wasn't just moving forward, he was going home. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon as Robert and David returned to the house, the sky awash in hues of orange and pink. Their boots left soft imprints in the snow-covered driveway as they stepped onto the porch, shaking off the cold before heading inside. The warmth of the house enveloped them instantly, the faint scent of pine and cinnamon still lingering from the day before. Robert shrugged off his coat and hung it by the door, glancing at David with a grin. I'd say that was a successful walk down memory lane, he said. David smiled, unwinding his scarf and tossing it onto the coat rack. Yeah, he said. It was good. Better than I expected. He paused, looking around the cozy living room. I didn't think I'd feel so connected. Like it's all still here, waiting for me. It never left, Robert said softly, his voice full of warmth. Sometimes we just need a little push to see it again. David nodded, his gaze settling on the Christmas tree in the corner. Its lights twinkled softly in the growing dimness, casting a warm glow across the room. He walked over, his fingers brushing lightly against one of the ornaments. This tree, David said with a chuckle. It's exactly how I remember Mom's. Simple, but perfect. She had a knack for that, Robert said, joining him by the tree, making things feel special without overcomplicating them. I try to keep that going. David glanced at him, his expression soft. You've done a good job, he said. Thanks, Robert replied, his smile growing. Come on, let's make this evening count. I've got an idea. David raised an eyebrow, following Robert into the kitchen. Another one of Margaret's recipes? He asked teasingly. Not this time, Robert said, pulling open a cabinet and retrieving a weathered wooden box. Something even better. David leaned against the counter, watching curiously as Robert opened the box and pulled out a deck of cards and a stack of old photographs. The cards were worn at the edges, and the photos were slightly faded, but both carried the weight of years of memories. Is that? David began, trailing off as he reached for the photos. Mom's collection, Robert said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I found them a while back. Thought you'd like to go through them with me. David held one of the photographs gently, his fingers brushing over the image of two boys playing in the snow. Their younger selves, bundled up in mismatched coats and grinning from ear to ear. I can't believe you still have these, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I kept everything I could, Robert said. It was my way of holding on to you, even when you weren't here. David looked up at him, his eyes shimmering. Thank you, he said, for keeping all of this safe. They spent the next hour sitting at the kitchen table, the photographs spread out before them like a map of their past. Each picture brought a new story, a new memory to unpack. Birthday parties, family vacations, quiet moments captured in the glow of a simpler time. Look at this one, Robert said, holding up a photo of David sitting on a sled, his face red from the cold but beaming with joy. This was the year you insisted you were going to build the biggest snowman in the neighborhood. David laughed, shaking his head, and it collapsed after 10 minutes. Right on top of you, Robert added, his grin widening. Mom was so worried. But you just sat there laughing. I think I forgot how much we laughed back then, David said, his voice soft. We laughed a lot, Robert said. Even when things were tough, we found reasons to smile. That's what Mom and Dad taught us. David nodded, his gaze lingering on another photo. This one of their parents sitting together on the porch, their arms wrapped around each other. I wish I could have had more time with them, he said quietly. So do I, Robert said, his tone gentle. But you know what? They'd be so proud of you, David. Of us. For finding our way back to each other. David looked at him, his throat tightening. You really think so? I know so, Robert said firmly. After they'd gone through all the photos, Robert shuffled the deck of cards and grinned. All right, ready to lose? David arched an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. Lose? Are you forgetting who taught you how to play cards? Oh, I remember, Robert said, dealing the first hand. But you're a little rusty, big shot. Let's see if you can still keep up. The game began, their banter light and playful. The cards slapped against the table, and their laughter filled the room, blending with the occasional crackle of the fire from the other room. It felt easy, natural, like the years apart had never happened. As the evening wore on, the brothers settled into a comfortable rhythm. The conversation ebbed and flowed between laughter and quiet reflection, each moment deepening the bond that had been rebuilt over the past few days. By the time the clock on the wall struck 10, the card game had devolved into a series of ridiculous wagers, with Robert threatening to make David shovel the driveway solo if he lost the next round. You're bluffing, David said, grinning as he laid down his cards. Am I? Robert replied, revealing his hand with a triumphant flourish. David groaned, slumping back in his chair. All right, fine. But if I'm doing the driveway, you're making me more of that cocoa. Deal, Robert said with a laugh, extending his hand for a mock handshake. The brothers cleaned up the table together, the warmth of the evening lingering between them like an unspoken promise. As they stood by the kitchen door, staring out at the snow-covered yard, David let out a contented sigh. This feels good, he said quietly. Robert turned to him, his expression soft. It is good, he said. And it's just the start, David. There's a whole lot more ahead of us. David nodded, his smile widening. I'm looking forward to it. As they turned off the lights and headed to their rooms, the house felt alive with a new sense of hope. For the first time in years, both brothers knew they weren't alone, and that, together, they could face whatever came next. The next morning arrived quietly, the pale winter sun casting long shadows across the snowy yard. The world outside was still, the only sound the occasional chirp of a bird or the soft groan of snow shifting under its weight. Inside the house, the warmth of the previous days lingered like an invisible thread, pulling Robert and David closer together. Robert stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. The rich aroma of maple syrup filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee brewing nearby. He hummed softly to himself, a habit Margaret had teased him about endlessly. Smells amazing in here, David said, stepping into the kitchen and rubbing his hands together. His cheeks were slightly flushed from washing up, and his hair was still damp. Morning, Robert said, glancing over his shoulder with a grin. I figured I'd start the day with something simple. Can't go wrong with pancakes. David grabbed a mug from the counter and poured himself some coffee. If they're anything like yesterday's, I'm sold. Margaret's recipe strikes again, Robert said with a wink. They sat down at the small kitchen table, their plates piled high with golden pancakes and butter melting in glistening pools. For a while, they ate in companionable silence, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around them like a blanket. Robert, David said suddenly, his fork hovering mid-air. Yeah. David hesitated, then set his fork down, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about staying here for a while. Robert looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. And David sighed, running a hand through his hair. It feels right. Like maybe this is where I'm supposed to be right now. I've spent so many years drifting, trying to figure out what I was looking for. But here, I don't know, it feels different. Robert's face softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. That's because this is where you belong, David. You don't have to wander anymore. This can be your home, as long as you want it to be. David nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. I think I'd like that, he said. Good, Robert said firmly, because I wasn't about to let you leave anyway. David chuckled, shaking his head. You always were stubborn. Runs in the family, Robert replied, his grin widening. They finished breakfast, the conversation flowing easily between them. Robert told stories about the neighborhood, the quirky neighbors, the annual summer barbecues, and the small but tight-knit community he'd come to cherish over the years. David listened intently, his smile growing as he imagined himself becoming part of this world. It sounds nice, he said finally. Quiet, steady. It is, Robert said, and I think you'll fit right in. As they cleared the table and washed the dishes, David leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. You know, he said, his voice quieter now, I've been thinking about what I want to do. With my life, I mean. Robert paused, turning to face him. Yeah? What's on your mind? David hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know exactly. I just know I want to do something that matters. Something that feels real. Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've got time to figure that out, he said. There's no rush. But whatever it is, I'm here to help you make it happen. David looked at him, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thanks, Robert. That means a lot. Of course, Robert said, his voice steady. We're in this together now. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small tasks, tidying up, sorting through old boxes, and rearranging a few shelves to make space for David's things. As they worked, they talked about everything and nothing, their laughter echoing through the house. By early afternoon, they found themselves back in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows casting a warm glow on the walls. Robert picked up one of the photo albums they'd looked through the night before and set it on the coffee table. I was thinking, he said, flipping through the pages, about how we can start making some new memories, not just revisiting the old ones. David sat down beside him, his curiosity piqued. What did you have in mind? Well, Robert began, tapping a photo of their parents at a family picnic. We could start with something simple, maybe a trip to the park, like we used to do. Or we could try out that diner down the street, you know, the one with the neon sign. David laughed softly. I saw that place yesterday. It looked straight out of the 50s. It practically is, Robert said, grinning. Best burgers in town, though, and their milkshakes are to die for. All right, David said, nodding. That sounds like a plan. But only if you promise not to embarrass me in public. No promises, Robert replied, his grin widening. They laughed together, the sound filling the room with a sense of ease that felt as natural as breathing. As the day stretched on, the brothers began to sketch out a vision for the future. Not just a plan, but a foundation for the life they wanted to build together. For David, it was a chance to finally plant roots and create a sense of stability he'd been missing for so long. For Robert, it was a chance to share the home and community he'd built with the one person who had always been at the center of his heart. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of gold and lavender, the house felt alive with possibilities. David leaned back on the couch, a contented smile on his face. You know, he said, I wasn't sure what I'd find when I came back here. But now, I think I found more than I ever expected. Robert nodded, his smile warm. You found home, he said simply. David looked at him, his expression thoughtful but peaceful. Yeah, he said softly. I did. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, bouncing off the snow outside and filling the house with a golden glow. Robert was already up, sipping coffee by the kitchen counter as he flipped through the local newspaper. The hum of the heater blended with the faint crackle of the fire he'd started earlier in the living room. David entered the room, yawning and stretching. His hair stuck up in odd angles, and he looked groggy but peaceful, as though he'd slept better than he had in years. Morning, David mumbled, grabbing a mug and pouring himself some coffee. Morning, Robert replied, glancing up from the paper. How'd you sleep? Like a rock? David said, sitting at the table and cradling the warm mug in his hands. I could get used to this. Robert chuckled. Good. Because I thought we'd tackle something together today. David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Tackle what? Robert folded the newspaper and set it aside. The garage, he said, grinning. It's a disaster zone in there. Margaret used to call it my project graveyard. David laughed softly. Sounds like a challenge. All right, lead the way. After finishing their coffee, the brothers bundled up and headed out to the detached garage. Inside, it was exactly as Robert had described. A jumble of old tools, half-finished woodworking projects, and dusty boxes piled high on shelves. The faint smell of motor oil lingered in the air, mixing with the cold, crisp scent of winter. Wow, David said, surveying the chaos. You weren't kidding. Where do we even start? Over here, Robert said, motioning toward a corner stacked with crates and bins. We'll sort through this stuff first. Most of it hasn't been touched in years. They set to work, pulling out boxes and sorting through their contents. At first, the task felt overwhelming, but soon they fell into an easy rhythm, the steady pace of their work punctuated by laughter and conversation. Look at this, David said, holding up an old wooden sign that read "Welcome to the Smith's home." The paint was chipped, but the words were still legible. Robert grinned. I made that years ago, he said. Margaret wanted a personalized sign for the front door, but I never got around to finishing it. David turned the sign over in his hands, inspecting it closely. You know, he said, with a little sanding and some fresh paint, this could look good as new. You think so? Robert asked, his expression curious. Yeah, David said. I used to do odd jobs for a carpenter back in the day. Picked up a few tricks along the way. I could fix this up for you if you want. Robert's smile widened. I'd like that. It'd be good to see it finished. As they continued sorting, David came across a dusty cardboard box tucked in the corner. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old tools and well-worn notebooks. These were Dad's, weren't they? David asked, his voice quiet. Robert looked over, his expression softening. Yeah, he said. He was always tinkering with something. Fixing the toaster, building birdhouses. He loved working with his hands. David ran his fingers over one of the notebooks, the pages filled with sketches and measurements in their father's neat handwriting. He was good at it, David said. I remember watching him work when I was little. He always made it look so easy. Robert nodded, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. He had a knack for it. I think he would have liked seeing us working out here together. David glanced up at him, his eyes glistening. I think so too, he said. The morning passed quickly as they sorted through the clutter, rediscovering old treasures and laughing at the oddities they unearthed. By midday, the garage was noticeably more organized, with tools hung neatly on the walls and boxes labeled and stacked in tidy rows. As they stood back to admire their progress, Robert clapped a hand on David's shoulder. Not bad for a couple of amateurs, he said with a grin. David laughed, brushing the dust off his jeans. I'd say we did pretty well. Come on, Robert said, motioning toward the house. Let's take a break. I'll make lunch. Back in the warm kitchen, the brothers sat down to sandwiches and chips, their conversation light and easy. You know, Robert said, taking a bite of his sandwich, it feels good having you here. Working together, talking. It feels like old times. David nodded, his smile soft. It does. And honestly, it feels good to have something to work on. To feel like I'm part of something again. You are, Robert said firmly. This is your home now, David. And there's plenty more where today came from. Projects, plans, all of it. We'll keep building one day at a time. David looked at him, his throat tightening with gratitude. Thanks, Robert, for giving me this chance. You don't have to thank me, Robert said, his voice steady. We're brothers. This is what we do. As the afternoon stretched on, the brothers sat by the fire, their conversation drifting from the past to the future. They talked about the projects they wanted to tackle, the places they wanted to visit, and the new traditions they could create together. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snowy yard, the house felt alive with the promise of what was to come. For David, it wasn't just about rediscovering the past. It was about building a future he could be proud of, one step at a time, with his brother by his side. The day after their garage project, Robert proposed an idea over breakfast. "How about we take a little trip into town today?" he asked, his tone casual as he poured syrup over his pancakes. David looked up from his coffee, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Into town? What for?" "I thought you might like to see the place," Robert said, leaning back in his chair. "It's changed a bit since we were kids, but not too much. Besides, there's someone I'd like you to meet." David raised an eyebrow. "Oh, who's that?" Robert smiled knowingly. "You'll see." The mid-morning sun was bright as they stepped out of the house and climbed into Robert's truck. The engine hummed as they pulled onto the main road, the snow-dusted landscape rolling by in a blur of white and gray. "It's strange," David said, staring out the window. "I've been through so many towns over the years, but none of them ever felt like this. Like home." "That's because this place is home," Robert said firmly, "and it always will be. You're part of it, whether you've been here or not." David nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess I didn't think I'd ever feel that again." "Well," Robert said with a grin, "stick with me, and I'll make sure you do." The truck rumbled into the heart of town, where the streets were lined with small shops and cafes. Colorful signs hung in frosted windows, and wreaths adorned nearly every door. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where people greeted each other by name and strangers rarely stayed that way for long. Robert parked in front of a quaint diner with a bright neon sign that read Betty's Diner, home of the best milkshakes in town. "This place is a classic," Robert said as they stepped out of the truck. "Betty's been running it for as long as I can remember. Everyone comes here. It's like the unofficial town square." David followed his brother inside, the sound of a bell jingling above the door announcing their arrival. The air was warm and filled with the scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee. The walls were lined with black and white photos of the town through the years, and the vinyl booths looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. "Robert," a cheerful voice called out. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s with a kind smile and bright blue eyes. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a red apron embroidered with the diner's name. "Hey, Betty," Robert said, his smile widening. "How's business?" "Busy, as always," Betty replied, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her gaze shifted to David, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "And who's this? Don't tell me Robert finally made a friend." David laughed softly, and Robert rolled his eyes. "Betty, this is my brother, David. He's back in town." Betty's smile softened, her eyes glinting with recognition. "David," she said warmly, "well, it's about time. I've heard so much about you over the years. Welcome home." David blinked, surprised. "You've heard about me?" "Of course," Betty said, motioning for them to take a seat at the counter. "Your brother never stops talking about you. Always said he hoped you'd find your way back here someday." David glanced at Robert, his chest tightening at the quiet sincerity in his brother's expression. "Thanks," he said quietly, taking a seat. As they ordered milkshakes and a basket of fries to share, Betty chatted with him about the town. How the bookstore down the street had been taken over by a young couple with big dreams, how the town council was planning a spring festival, and how everyone still swore by her chocolate cream pie. "It's good to see the two of you together," Betty said, setting their milkshakes down in front of them. "Feels like things are as they should be." David smiled, taking a sip of his milkshake. The rich, creamy flavor brought back a rush of memories, and he found himself relaxing into the moment. After they finished, Robert paid the bill, and Betty slipped an extra slice of pie into a takeout box for them. "On the house," she said with a wink. "Come back soon, okay?" "Thanks, Betty," Robert said, tipping his hat as they headed out the door. As they walked back to the truck, David glanced over at his brother. "She's nice," he said. "She's more than that," Robert replied. "She's the heart of this town, always looking out for everyone, always making sure people feel welcome. Kind of like how Mom was." David nodded, his smile softening. "Yeah, I can see that." They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through town, stopping at the bookstore Betty had mentioned and picking up a few things at the hardware store for their next project. Everywhere they went, people greeted Robert warmly, and though David felt like a stranger at first, the warmth extended to him, too. By the time they returned home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. David carried the takeout box of pie into the kitchen, setting it on the counter as Robert hung up his coat. "That was good," David said, his voice quiet. Robert looked at him, his expression gentle. "Yeah, it was," he said. "And there's more where that came from, David. This town, this life, it's yours to be part of. All you have to do is say yes." David nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I think I'm ready," he said softly. Robert smiled, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome home, little brother." As they sat down at the kitchen table to share the pie, the house felt warmer than ever, a beacon of hope, family, and new beginnings. As the days went by, David began to settle into a routine that felt both new and familiar. The quiet mornings having coffee with Robert, the afternoons tinkering with what they needed in the shed, and the evenings filled with laughter and lights. Everything seemed like a second chance, a life he never thought he'd have again. It was as if Christmas had been reborn in his heart every day. One particularly quiet night, the brothers were sitting near the fireplace, with the Christmas tree still glowing softly in the corner of the room. The snow kept falling outside, covering the world beyond the windows with a cozy silence. David leaned back in his armchair, holding a mug of hot chocolate, his gaze thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "if someone had told me a few weeks ago that I'd be here, back in my home, surrounded by all of this, I wouldn't have believed it." Robert smiled, leaning forward with his own mug. "Funny how life works sometimes," he said. "You think you're lost, but really, you're just finding your way back to where you've always been meant to be." David nodded, his chest tight with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for all of this, Robert. For everything." "You don't have to," Robert replied warmly. "Family doesn't need thanks. We just need each other." The brothers sat in silence for a moment, the soft sound of the crackling fire between them. Finally, David looked up, his expression lighter. "You know," he said with a small smile, "this whole Christmas thing, it's not just about the day, is it? It's about what it represents. Family, forgiveness, new beginnings. It's something you carry with you." Robert nodded, his gaze steady. "Exactly," he said. "Christmas is a reminder. It's about creating memories, valuing what matters, and finding joy in even the simplest moments. And the food helps," he added with a wink. David laughed, shaking his head. "It always comes back to food with you, doesn't it?" "Hey, you can't argue with tradition," Robert said. "Speaking of which," he bent down beside the armchair and grabbed a small wrapped package. Handing it to David, he smiled. "Go ahead, open it." David hesitated, his fingers brushing over the paper. Then, carefully, he opened it, revealing a sleek hardcover book. The title read, "Sweet Christmas Memories, Simple Recipes to Warm the Soul." David flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he saw the recipes inside. Molasses gingerbread cookies, spiced hot cider, Christmas fudge, all accompanied by little notes reflecting moments of family togetherness. "This," David said, his voice breaking. "This is perfect." Robert smiled. "I thought you'd like it. Recipes like these help build traditions and keep the memories alive. I think the best part is that they bring people together. That's how it was with us, wasn't it?" David closed the book, holding it tightly in his hands. "It was," he answered, his voice choked up. Just as Robert and David discovered, recipes have a unique power. They not only fill the table but also warm the heart and create moments that last forever. And that's exactly why we created the ebook Sweet Christmas Memories, Simple Recipes to Warm the Soul. With easy, meaningful recipes, you'll have everything you need to make your Christmas even more special. These are recipes that can bring your family together, bring smiles, and build the memories you'll carry with you for a lifetime. Click the link in the pinned comment to get your copy of Sweet Christmas Memories. Don't let this Christmas be just another one. Make it a celebration filled with unforgettable moments. Because Christmas isn't about what's under the tree. It's about who's around you and how you share those moments together. Don't miss any videos. Subscribe now and let us know what you thought of this video in the comments.